Welcome to episode number 1 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. This show will feature interviews with retired FBI agents who will talk about their careers and their most intriguing cases. I'll also talk about crime fiction and drama, books, movies, television shows depicting the FBI. Before we get to our first interview, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI investigations. I spent most of my 26-year career working on an economic crime squad, investigating Ponzi schemes, advanced fee scams, business-to-business telemarketing fraud, and corporate corruption and embezzlements. During the last 5 years of my FBI career, I served as the media coordinator and spokesperson for the Philadelphia division. Even though I'm now a full-time author, I can't seem to get media and public relations out of my system. So I am embracing my inner Oprah and producing FBI Retired Case File Review. Just one more thing before I introduce my guest. I want to let you know that photos and links to news articles about the cases discussed can always be found at jerrywilliams.com in the show notes under the Blogcast tab. And now, here's the show. This is Jerry Williams, and with me today is Tom Cotton. Tom is a retired agent. He served, how many years did you serve, Tom?
25.
25 years with the FBI. But the interesting thing is he retired over 20 years ago. So I would imagine that the FBI may be a little different in some ways than it was when you were an agent. What do you think?
Absolutely. When I started, Mr. Hoover was the director, and there was no computers. We weren't required to wear bulletproof vests until 1986. But the job basically is the same. It's just we have more cases that we investigate now, or the Bureau does now, than when I was in. But it's a different era. Ever since 9/11 changed the face of law enforcement internationally, and I think the men and women that are in the Bureau today are more geared towards terrorism than they were the general criminal cases that I had.
And why don't you tell me a little bit about those cases? Tell me what offices you were assigned to, and then the kind of work that you did while you were there.
My first office was Charlotte. 1971, I was sent to a little RA with one other agent, and general criminal work, some applicant work. I was sent to New York. Second office, I was on a Soviet surveillance squad, followed Russian spies for about a year, and then I spent the next 3.5 years working bank robberies. I left New York. I went to Spanish school in D.C., at WFO.
What's WFO?
Oh, Washington Field Office.
Okay, I know, but I want to make sure the people listening know.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So I studied Spanish 8 hours a day. The class was 8 hours a day for 6 months, and after that I volunteered and went to our San Juan office in Puerto Rico, where I worked basically security cases and international terrorism. Upon my transferred from San Juan, I went to Miami. I worked white-collar crime for a little while, and then most of the time I spent on organized crime and had a pretty good-sized case, Chicago mob guy out of Chicago. And
in Miami?
In Miami. Well, he was from Chicago, but the case was part of it was in Miami, and we were able to indict him on a matter that was passed down to me that had been going on for 10 years, interstate transportation of stolen property. I left Miami in 1983 and got my OP to Dallas, Texas. And in Dallas...
And again, can you tell everybody what OP stands for?
Office of Preference Transfer. I got senior enough on the waiting list to get an automatic transfer as Office of Preference. And when I arrived there, I was assigned an undercover case involving copyright violation and had a real good time. Indicted a Japanese citizen who fled, went back to Japan, and after about a year working through the Department of Justice in D.C., our headquarters in Washington, and Department of State, we extradited him back to Dallas, and he was summarily sent to federal prison for the case that we had against him.
Now, it sounds like during your FBI career, you had 5 or 6 transferred to different offices. Is that typical?
Oh, absolutely not. I think today Well, back in the day, my day, you were in your first office up to a year, and then your second office was it. And it would have been a top 10 field office in that time. I caused a transfer to Spanish school to get out of New York. And then I volunteered to go to San Juan, although I would have been sent to a field office coming out of language school. San Juan was a contract office in that you had to stay a minimum of 2 years. I stayed 3.5, and then was transferred to Miami. Miami was not my first choice to go. Dallas was, so that transfer, the officer preference transfer, I guess you might say, I caused as well. So all in all, the Bureau gave me 3, and I got 3.
Now, you've also worked a variety of cases. You talked about following Soviets, and you talked about bank robberies, and then you talked about this intellectual property case. Of all of the things that you worked, all of your assignments, what was your favorite?
Well, every office I was assigned to, there was always a favorite case because of the area and the concentration of the violations that we had. I enjoyed the bank robberies, but the challenging case working the terrorism bank robberies in San Juan was that they would rob banks with about 10 individuals wearing theatrical makeup and stolen cars. It was quite an interesting case, and they were recruiting participants from the United States as well as France and the Caribbean. So none of these people had prior convictions, so it was difficult to identify them, and we managed to get a pretty good number of them put away. In Miami, I guess the most enjoyable case was the one against Marshall Caifano, a Chicago mob guy. He was involved in theft of Westinghouse stock certificates that were used as collateral for bank loans that the mob was getting. And, of course, they would default once they realized that the certificates were stolen. Well, anyhow, there was a connection in Miami, and I was able to get an informant who had been in federal penitentiary with Caifano in Atlanta to give me some good information about Caifano. And subsequently, Jimmy Fradiano, a.k.a. also known as the Weasel, knew Fradiano. And when we did a search looking for information that was in the Bureau, Fradiano came up, and he was willing to testify, came and described some of the murders that they were involved in over the years. And so that was a very enjoyable case. When I got to Dallas, I had that copyright violation against Mr. Tatsuro Yamamoto, usual spelling. and then I ran the applicant program for about 6 years. In about 1990, the Bureau had a hiring freeze and basically shut down recruiting, so I went on to a public corruption and government fraud squad.
Okay, now you're talking my thing. Definitely worked most of my career doing fraud and corruption, so I'm very interested in any of your big cases. Is there a big case in the corruption fraud area that you'd like to talk about?
Well, there was a case that involved a buyer at Bell Helicopter in Fort Worth, Texas, on the V-22 Osprey project. His name was Bill Hodge. And he was taking kickbacks from vendors selling connectors, for the dashboard on the aircraft and so forth, wiring harnesses and so forth. And co-case agent, actually I was the administrative agent on that case, but Bill Epbright had been working government fraud for a long time. Damn good agent. Was able, through his connection with his cohorts in Phoenix, they got an informant from Phoenix to come to Dallas. And this guy was the best informant I've ever seen in my entire life. He managed to work his way into this Bill Hodge and the other vendors. And one of the vendors, Walter Magruder, in a conversation, bragged about how he had a connection with Dallas City Hall. So we pursued that, and as it turns out, Walter was factoring his accounts receivable through City Councilman Paul Fielding. And Fielding was using him as a minority contractor to attract other contractors to factor their services. Fielding was also interested in getting a contract with the city of Dallas. He couldn't do it himself, so there was Al Lipscomb was a councilman coming off at the end of his term, and he couldn't go back because there was a 3-term limit. Al Lipscomb was a minority, and he had bragged that he had connections all over the city, and they could sell cleaning products to the big stores, food markets, etc., as well as sell de-icing equipment to the city of Dallas. Paul Fielding also had his territory, I guess the best way of saying it, where he was a councilman, his district is what I'm trying to say, included the old company EDS, run by Ross Perot. EDS was moving from the northern part of the city out to a suburbs called Plano, Texas. Paul Fielding helped them get that property rezoned, and in return, he wanted them to give him the cleaning contract at their new office building, quid pro quo, all against city rules and regulations and, of course, the violation for the public corruption.
How much would that contract have been worth? How much would he have been able to gain by the quid pro quo?
You're asking me to go back to about 25 years.
But it sounds like hundreds of thousands of dollars he would have gained from that potential contract.
He did get the contract, and if I recall correctly, it was about $500,000.
Okay. So definitely you're talking about a corrupt politician, and it's strange because the case didn't start off that way. It did not start off involving city council or city businesses.
That's correct. It's just the way you never know where a case is going to take you, and it surprises us, not only myself, but many other agents. The significance of this case against Paul Fielding was that Public Corruption and Government Fraud Squad was relatively new in Dallas. And this was the first time that a sitting city councilman had been indicted. We knew for a long time that there was a lot of corruption in city politics. To use the phrase, the good old boy system, it was alive and well. But the problem was, it was so good that only if you weren't an insider, you couldn't get in. And having informants was extremely important.
And did you have informants in this particular case?
The informant we had was actually on the government fraud side of the case, and he stayed with it and was able to, as a matter of fact, he had a meeting with Paul Fielding and Al Lipscomb in the mayor's chambers that we recorded. And in that, they discussed how when Al would come off of his seat, retire from his seat, and get into business with Fielding, that everyone would buy from him because he was, quote, an 800-pound gorilla, unquote, and they would know that if they didn't buy from him, what would happen.
Wow. Yeah. That must have been like what they call the smoking gun.
Well, it was more than a smoking gun. Everyone that heard the tape was applauding how well the informant was able to get them to talk about all this. The other significant aspect of this case, which you won't read about in any case reports or in any news reports, is that our undercover agent was a young first office agent.
So this would have been one of the first cases he worked on in general, and then being at such a high-level corruption case. Wow, that's pretty exciting.
It is, and after I retired and the case agent, Bill Epbright, transferred to Florida, to Orlando, Florida, Don Sherman, who was the first office agent, took over the lead in prosecuting public corruption cases, and he had 2 successful indictments and convictions on other city officials, and currently, although Don's retired, currently the Dallas office has under indictment one of the biggest known city commissioners, John Wiley Price. To give you an idea how significant that case is, he was making $125,000 a year, but was driving Rolls Royces, wore fancy suits, and had all kinds of property that he bought and was renting out, and couldn't do it on $125,000 a year. When they did the search warrant at his house, I read this in the paper, they brought a safe cracker with them because the information was there was $160,000 in a safe that he had in his house.
Cash?
Cash.
Can you tell me what some of the sentences were in these particular cases? How much time did they get? Were there any forfeitures?
There wasn't anything to forfeiture on the government fraud case, but Bill Hodge from Bell Helicopter, Walter Magruder, and a couple of other contractors from Oklahoma got between 5 and 10 years, depending upon their involvement. Bill Hodge got the 10 years, the others between 5 and 10. When Paul Fielding went to trial 2 years after that, I was in the courtroom because I had retired, and they were playing the tape of that meeting that I described in the mayor's office. Fielding had pled not guilty. When the tape started, with Al Lipscomb starting to say, "I am an 800-pound gorilla," Paul Fielding shot up from his chair and announced to the judge that he's now pleading guilty.
Fantastic. Definitely that evidence sealed the case. Is there anything else that you wanted to tell us about that case, your career, the FBI in general?
Well, it was probably one of the most successful investigations in public corruption and government fraud in the history of the Dallas field office. And I like to feel that Bill Eppright and myself helped train Don Sherman, who picked the ball up, ran with it, and he trained another agent who currently has the case on John Wiley Price. It makes you feel good that there's a tradition of good hard work, good investigation with outstanding results. I have said on several occasions, I didn't realize this at the time, but when I retired, after I retired, I realized that I was married to my job as an FBI agent. I think it's the greatest job I've ever had. I wouldn't have traded for anything. The men and women that I have met throughout my career, I'm still friends with, I still see, still talk to. There were 10 agents who I vacationed with. Our connection was we all worked in Charlotte field office. I vacationed with them for over 25 years with their families.
So this is pretty amazing, and I think it's something myself as a retired agent understands, but I don't know if the public does. So you've actually been retired from the FBI for 20 years, but you still are as connected, it sounds, as you were when you were actually working.
Very true. Howard Bergen trained me in Rockingham, North Carolina. And I still visit him about every other year at his retirement house in Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And he has been to Dallas to visit me. I'm planning to go visit him probably in another 2 or 3 months down in South Carolina. The relationships, the family atmosphere that the FBI was, and to a certain extent still is, was something that was never written in any advertisement. You'll never see it on any job site for the Bureau, but it was just a cohesiveness where we took care. These are people that you're strangers. You get assigned to a field office, and you get to know these men and women and their families. It becomes just an extension of your family. I don't know how really to describe it other than it is a second family that I have. Being married, you would expect to have a second family, would you not? That's mine.
Thank you so much, Tom. And Tom Cotton is not only a retired agent living now in the Philadelphia area, but he is also the chairman of the Charles Reed Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI. Thank you so much, Tom, for letting me interview you.
Well, Jerry, thank you for taking the time. I never expected to be interviewed about my career, but I'm glad that it has happened, and I'm really particularly glad that you're the one that did the interview.
And that's the end of the show. Don't forget, at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos and links to related news articles in the show notes for this interview. Today's episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I hope we can connect again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review. Thank you.